Hi, everyone. For the recording, my name is Todd Trebor. My pronouns are he, him, and his. And I'm the organization's program director at RISCA. We want to welcome you all today to Understanding Disability and Improving Accessibility. I'm going to do some housekeeping stuff before I turn it over to my friend and colleague, Jeannine Chartier. But 1 second. There we go. I wanted to start off our meeting with a land acknowledgement, as is our practice at all of our public-facing meetings at RISCA. It is RISCA's practice to acknowledge that the grounds on which we are meeting are Indigenous lands. Our offices in Providence and on all of Rhode Island are on the ancestral homelands of the Narragansett Nation. RISCA is a committed ally, and as artists, we honor the Indigenous people, their ancestors, the culture, and the artistic representation, past, present, and future. We recognize the continued existence and contributions of Indigenous people to our society today. Again, thank you all for being here. Some rules of the road for you all. First off, we do have transcription or closed caption service available for this call. So along the bottom of your screen, you should see something that says CC. If you click on that, you will see the option for a live transcript to be shared, and I'm enabling that for those of you who request it now. Great. Adulting. That's something that Jeannine and I borrowed from our friend Bria Heidelberg. Adult as necessary during this call. Feel free to have your cameras off. Feel free to take care of whatever you need to take care of. If you have human beings in your space, you need to help. If you have pets, you need to support, etc. Go ahead and do those things. Why these workshops and why we're offering them? I'll get to my new role as accessibility coordinator in a moment, but as part of our strategic plan, we are interested in promoting equity and access practices among organizations. And one of the things we did in the latter part of 2021 is we did a survey of our general operating support organizations and then had some conversations based on that survey. And based on that survey, what we found were the greatest needs in that sample of 60 organizations was a need for support, particularly for small, mid-size, and volunteer-led organizations on how to actualize equity practices at their organizations and where to kind of enter through and thinking about access work as well. That's what motivated this workshop. So Jeannine had conversations based on those survey results when she organized them. I'll let her introduce herself in a moment. And Jeannine also looked at the survey results and kind of saw where there were patterns and where there were kind of shared holes in information. And one of the things that we'll learn about next week in our workshop next week is working with communities or people who are neurodiverse, because that was an area where there were a lot of organizations interested in learning more about how best to do that. So that was what motivated it. It was a need that we were hearing from you all around this, both through survey results and then through conversations after that. I'm also RISCA's 504 accessibility coordinator. That used to be Randy Rosenbaum, our executive director. When he retired, I'm the person who that went to, which I was excited to do. Jeannine and I have been talking about ways of working on this kind of work for a while, or focusing on this kind of work. So what that means, it's actually a very specific designation. Every state arts agency has to have one. Charles Baldwin, the amazing Charles Baldwin's here today, and he'll talk about that. He does that work at Mass Cultural Council. So I'm charged with serving as a consultant within RISCA about access issues and responsible for ensuring that planning for access is incorporated in all our organizational decisions. And I'm the point of contact for the arts and culture sector in Rhode Island on issues of access and accessibility. So if there's things you're looking for, information you're looking for, reach out to me. If I don't know how to find it, I'll figure out how to find it. One of the things that Jeannine and I are working on now currently too is starting an accessibility task force at RISCA, developing some resource pages on our website, just connecting with other resources that are out there. And also over time, I will be implementing requirements around 504 requirements among our grantees. Don't be scared by that. I will support you in that process. It's actually not that difficult. It's just something we need to be on top of. I will be monitoring the chat space for questions and later discussion. So during the course of this workshop, Jeannine's going to go over how it's going to run, but we're going to ask that you put questions you have in the chat for us to answer at a Q&A session at the end of this workshop. If you can't put questions in the chat, don't worry. In the Q&A session, you'll be able to unmute and ask questions as well, but I'll be monitoring that and kind of aggregating shared questions that people might have. And I believe, Jeannine, I've said all the things, so I'm going to turn it over to you.
Okay, I think I'm unmuted. So hi, yeah, I'm Jeannine Chartier. I am the director of Arts Equity, which for many years was known as VSA Arts Rhode Island. And I am an artist with a disability. So I come to this work through a lifetime of A, trying to make art, and B, trying to figure out how to move through the world. And so I'm really excited that we have all come together to get to do this. Our vision, because why not keep it really big, is that we see a world where difference, disability, or language are no longer barriers. I happen to use, when I write disability, the dis with the backslash and the ability. And I will just be using that word when I go through my narrative. And within disability, I use that in a broad sense to include all kinds of difference, whether it's neurodiversity or sensory or physical or medical. Again, it's an umbrella term for me so that we can cut down on some of the repetitious language. So our goal here is to enable participants, which is you all, to create lasting and formative change about equity, diversity, and inclusion. And this ties into the work that RISCA has been doing about EDI, with, as he said, Dr. Brea Heidelberg, and earlier pieces. So I look at this as one larger process where we're all trying to improve the kind of changes that we're making. And for a very specific objective, I hope by the end of these 2 sessions, you will be armed with expert advice and practical solutions that you'll be able to take into making your organization's access plan. And as you, I think, know, now in the grants that you will fill out for RISCA, there is a place where you will answer questions having to do like, what's 1 or 2 things you'll do in this next grant cycle to improve your access. And in alignment with that, there will be a spot in the budget, which is huge, where you will be able to actually put money in to create those access. So this is not just a theoretical, oh, wouldn't it be great to make access? But here's a way for you to target what kind of access that you're going to want to make and ask for some money so that RISCA can help you make it. Excuse me, I've got some water here. Conor Moynihan is going to join us. We are so fortunate that he has now become part of RISD Museum and just happened to put up this amazing show called Variance. And he will get into more of that later. But it just is phenomenal. And when he came to RISD, I'm going to snitch on you a little bit, Conor. He said that for his capstone or keystone or final project, whatever it was, he wanted to do an exhibit that showed off works that were in the museum catalog. And they basically said back to him, works that address disability specifically. And they said back to him, well, you know, we don't really think we have enough of those to do a show. And he went back and looked in all the catalogs, and they had so much work. He's going to be able to do like 3 or 4 more shows, right, by the time we're done. And so again, disability is so much sometimes in the groundwater and in the air around us that we don't even see it because it's not brought to our attention. So we're going to do a little bit of that today. And also, I'm going to talk a little bit after Conor about the pop culture stereotypes about disability. Because again, there's so many things that play out around us that we don't recognize. So I'm going to do a little recognizing of them so we can see how that has fit into our lives and maybe how that has given us ideas that we didn't even necessarily know we were building. And then we'll take a quick break, a quick stretch. When we come back, I'm going to go a bit into the evolution of disability law and culture, because it's disability law actually that is now why RISCA is, and all the other arts councils, is having people improve the access in their programs and providing some money to do that. And there's a series of things we're going to talk about. I'm going to talk about the capital crawl, intersectionality, ableism and unconscious bias, medical versus the social model, and language. And if we start running out of time, I'm prepared to bump the medical and language into the workshop that we will do next week, because I want to make sure we all have an understanding of what these things are. And then we will go into the fabulous Charles Baldwin, and he will give us examples from a program that he runs for the Massachusetts Cultural Council. And so particularly, I want to thank everybody, not only for joining us today, but I want to thank you all for really being so forthright and helpful in the information that you sent us in response to when we sent out the survey asking about what your knowledge of disability was and what your problems maybe in creating access was. And your honesty was really important because it really has led us to creating these two workshops to help you understand and figure those things out, because we realize that we are all overwhelmed by this. And, and why shouldn't we be? We've been given centuries of time where we told that disability is bad and wrong, and it just seeps in through our pores. And we don't really know how to go about improving it. We think of obvious things like, a stairway may need a ramp, but we get confused because we don't even realize all that unconscious bias that has come down on us. So it might seem overwhelming when we're now asking you to think about your accessibility and improve it. And how could it not? Because we've lived our lives in a world that has deliberately been designed to exclude and hide us away. And I do mean that very seriously, deliberately designed to keep us away from the mainstream. So there is a rationale as to how we got here. We've learned those lessons that they taught us. And so as part of our session that we had with Dr. Heidelberg, we were asked about how we can better understand our communities, not only the ones we personally belong to, whether that's an art form like musical theater, or whether that's a place we live like urban or rural, but also the ones that when we do this outreach work, we're looking to embrace. So as a place for that, and under Dr. Heidelberg's prompting, she said it mostly came down to knowing our history. So as a place to begin, we're going to learn a bit about our history, and I will turn it back over to Conor and Todd to talk about variance and what that looks like in our history. So grab yourself a cup of tea, enjoy this show.
Thank you, Jeannine. And while Conor getting his PowerPoint up, hold on, I'll stop sharing this one so he can do that. There we go. I will just give a quick introduction for Conor. Conor, again, thank you so much for being here today. Conor Moynihan is the Assistant Curator of Prints, Drawings, and Photographs, the Photographs Department at the RISCA Museum. Among his areas of interest include representations of disability in art and visual culture. His exhibition, Variance, Making, Unmaking, and Remaking Disability is currently on view at the RISCA Museum. Today, he will be discussing a few different models of disability using select works from the exhibition as illustrative examples. And something to mention too, you all received an email yesterday. Conor and Jeannine are arranging for free tours of the Variance exhibit led by Conor, both tomorrow from 3 to 5 p.m. and then on Saturday, May 7th, I believe, from 2 to 4 p.m. I'm going to drop a link to that forum in the chat, and you'll receive that link again if you're interested in attending. Very simple thing to fill out. You just RSVP and let us know how many people are going to come with you. Conor, I will let you take it away.
Thank you so much. And thank you both for inviting me to be here today and to talk about this exhibition. I'm really excited to share this with everyone. And I just want to give a brief overview. What I'm going to talk about today is I'm going to look at a few works that are in the exhibition Variance, Making, unmaking and remaking disability. But I want to sort of frame it through sort of different models of disability. And when I say that, I mean different paradigms through which we've understood disability in the past and how really activists today have sort of drawn our attention to the way disability has been framed in different cultural moments and what we can learn from that, and sort of that shift from being spoken for and then being able to speak from the position of disability. And Jeannine, also thank you for explaining the umbrella term of disability. You know, something that I came in through my experience with cancer and a brain tumor, and so relatively new to the community over the last maybe 7 or 8 years. But just acknowledging the wide range of people that sort of benefit, I think, when we center access and disability in the way that we work. Okay, so Variance, just as a brief overview, it is a permanent collection show at the RISD Museum. It has over 30 works in it, and the thesis of it really was what happens when we center disability as a critical lens to look at art. So in the show, there are works by non-disabled people making representations of disability, often in a negative and stigmatizing way, but also artists who identify as disabled, and they bring this into their work in a very imagistic way and sort of speak from their experiences. And I wanted this very broad range of works to give a detailed overview going all the way back to 1735, which is the oldest work in the exhibition, all the way up to more contemporary examples, works that really sort of speak to the pride of being disabled and that sort of experience. And then, you know, as Jeannine mentioned, you know, one thing I was thinking about with this show is that disability is around us all the time. And then when I talked about this, especially prior to realizing it, is people were uncertain what that meant. And part of that I've realized is that we recognize disability in individual moments, but we don't always link it together to realize that there is a history, there are cultures, there is a social context. And that's really what I wanted the show to highlight a bit. So I'm going to jump forward. So the 3 models that I'm going to, or I should say 4 models that I'm going to focus on. I'm going to focus on 3, but just there's many models beyond this. There's a lot of ways that disability activists have interpreted these. But one model I want to highlight is what is sometimes called the moral model of disability. It's similar to a religious model of disability, but in this model, disability is cast as a sign of personal or societal moral failing. And therefore, its disability is sort of a negative thing, a sign of a failure, a sign of an individual's failure, or sort of a moral failure on the societal level, which I'll unpack with the work where we can see that. But also I want to highlight the charity model. The charity model is something that actually presents itself as a positive, that we should be charitable to people with disabilities, but it also frames disability as tragedy and pitiable. And it sort of moves into what we might call inspiration porn, where disabled people are sort of lifted up and just sort of celebrated for overcoming sort of maybe basic or ordinary things, but not actually centering a disability experience or including a disability perspective in social justice. And these then also relate to the medical model of disability, which is a model that really came into prominence, I would say, in the early 20th century, 1940s. And this was this idea that disability is something that requires expertise, outside expertise, and then that cure is something that should be sought for, or medical intervention. And in absence of that, institutionalization, but the knowledge of the disabled body is given over to medical experts. So it's medical experts speaking for disability rather than what I really highlight for this show, which is the social model of disability. And the social model of disability, it has its origins in the UK in the 1960s. It was championed and coined in official sense in the 1980s by Michael Oliver, a disability activist in the UK. And it really resists a lot of those models that I shared before, and really centers the individual with a disability, and makes a distinction between disability, which is maybe which is not necessarily a condition of the body, but rather it's a manifestation when an impairment is not accommodated by the social and built environment. So rather than like the medical model, which pushes the onus of disability on the individual body and it needs cure, this model really puts forward that it's a societal problem, a social problem, an environmental problem, and that's where the address needs to happen. And a classic example of that is a mobility impairment that necessitates someone to use a wheelchair really only becomes disabling in an environment such as a building without an elevator or a street without curb cuts, right? That is these forms that privilege some types of bodies, some types of abilities over other types of abilities. And that's really the spirit of this exhibition, is really centering the social model. There's lots of ways that we can build on that social model, but just as a basic start, that's what I wanted to highlight. So now I want to just jump into some of the works that we can see some of these through. So this is a print by William Hogarth. It is from 1735. This is the oldest work in the exhibition. And I'm including this because it's sort of manifestation of the moral model of disability. And what we see here, this is the final print or the final image in a suite of prints, of 8 prints that convey a narrative. And the narrative follows Thomas Rakewell, who is this figure on the ground being shackled. And Thomas Rakewell was a real historical person. He was someone who was part of this newly minted middle class in England. His father was a merchant. And when his father passed away, he inherited his money. And he was a bit of a spendthrift, so lost it on gambling, prostitution, and alcohol. And he ends up in Bethlehem Hospital in London, an asylum, being institutionalized. And this is because both at that time, asylums were for sort of the confinement of people with neurodiversity, but also for people who were poor. Those were sort of overlapping categories at this time. But what's interesting about this print and what it reveals to us is that that what Hogarth is seeing is that being an excessive person and having neurodiversity as part of that excess, the suitable punishment for that would be incarceration or institutionalization, and that it's a moral failure, that led Thomas Rakewell to this place. And we see then that Hogarth is then creating this image, again, based on a real person, but all of these sort of fictive scenes of madness to sort of underscore this. So you have in that back doorway, you have someone sort of looking up with religious fervor at a cross. And then this other doorway, you have someone wearing a crown, sort of this self-aggrandized person. Again, this is how Hogarth imagined madness to be. But what I find really interesting about this print is this figure here on the wall, right here. What this man is doing is he's drawing on the wall, he's drawing a globe, and he's trying to solve the longitudinal problem. And the longitudinal problem is, in the 18th century England, sailors knew how to figure where they were at sea by latitude, but not longitude. And there was this great prize money for whoever could figure that out. But in Hogarth's day, it was widely believed to be a fool's errand, and that anyone who was trying to solve this had to be insane. And therefore, even though it was solved within a few decades, what Hogarth is doing here is giving this sign that's really recognizably madness in his day, but it's no longer recognizable today. And that's something I like to highlight too, is that our notion of disability or madness shifts over time. It's not something that's necessarily stable. But the end result of this print is truly sort of Hogarth is speaking to a wider public and sort of insisting on moderation. And then to be a moderate person is to be a normal person and to be a stable person. And that's what he's championing. And so this is what I mean about the moral model of disability, where we see Thomas Rakewell's excessive use of alcohol and gambling that led him to this position as a sign of madness, but also as a sign of moral failure. And then building from that, I now want to talk a bit about that charity model. So this is going to be a photograph that illustrates it. It's not necessarily in the making of it like we saw with Hogarth. So this is a photograph by Gary Winogrand. Winogrand is what is known as a street photographer. So he would go out into the streets of New York City in the 1960s and he would photograph what was around him. So he's not going out and necessarily looking for things. It's just sort of what is on the streets already there. But this is one of his photographs. And what we see is an African-American man on the street wearing a placard that says, "I'm blind and deaf," and asking for the generosity of the people around him. And on one level, we can see this as a positive, right? You know, that you have this woman who is giving this man money and supporting him and sort of responding to his needs. But this is very much fitting into the charity model, which is that first, disability is tragedy, and that our social structure, our social support system is begging on the street, right? This is his point of access for sustaining himself. And so I wanted to highlight this history because this is an image that we see all the time in art history, but it's also something that we see all the time in urban environments, right? The person with experiencing homelessness, and that we do know that people experiencing homelessness also have disproportionate rates of disability compared to other populations. So thinking about homelessness is also a disability justice concern. So that's, you know, in a charity model, again, where we're seeing using disability as a sign for charity, but also that that's the way that we treat people with disabilities, is that they are suffering, they're tragic, and so we're sharing our generosity with them. But that isn't the same as sort of centering their voice or lifting them up or changing the social structures to allow for a different perspective. And if you come to the exhibition, and I hope everyone can come to one of the 2 tours, sharing space with this work is this work by Laura Aguilar. And this is really what I was using to sort of represent today the social model of disability. And what we see in this photograph is a self-portrait of Aguilar. She's holding a cardboard sign that says "Artists will work for access." Access is spelled with an X. And she's standing before a wall, which underneath the words that spell gallery. And what I love about this photograph is it's taking that same vocabulary that we saw with Winogrand's photograph of someone begging on the street, but sort of re-scripting it from what I think is the social model of disability. And so a little bit of background for Aguilar, for those who don't know her, she was a Chicana lesbian photographer, active in Los Angeles in the 80s and 90s especially. But she's also someone who had auditory dyslexia. So written and spoken language was really challenging for her. And she said that growing up, you know, she thought that she just couldn't communicate, that that was just something that she couldn't do. And then in high school, she took her first photography class, and it just was world opening for her. It was a new pathway for her to be able to communicate. And what she realized was it wasn't that she couldn't communicate. She was just always being sort of expected to use one set of tools to communicate and not the ones that she communicates with the best. And therefore, as someone who was, you know, again, Chicana, lesbian, dyslexic, she also was very open with her experiences with depression and being fat. She was really experienced with what it felt like to be on the outside and sort of outside on, especially in the art world. And what I see this work doing is sort of re-scripting what we saw with Winogrand and really centering, you know, that access to galleries, access to spaces has less to do with the quality of, it's not necessarily about the quality of your work, but it's like what social systems are you able to tap into? And that's really the, you know, the model that I think she's following with this photograph. It's not that anyone who doesn't get into a gallery is more or less qualified as an artist, but it is about social systems and who gets access to resources, and therefore increasing access. And here she's saying she's willing to work for access, really highlights the need for access to sort of make equitable art institutions. So those were the 3 models that I wanted to highlight with these 3 works. But I also wanted to talk about this work by Riva Lehrer. This is a drawing on Mylar. And this is something that, you know, I do hope that you can come see the exhibition, because everything else I said will stay at the RISD Museum, but this is a loan, so it's only here until October 9th. And this is someone who's also, Riva Lehrer is a disabled artist. She identifies as disabled, and she really brings us into the image making of her work and her process. And I think the way that she works really speaks to the way we might think about access. So this comes from a body of work she did called the Risk Pictures. And in the wrist pictures, she is thinking about the power dynamics of portraiture and the power dynamics of the stare, being stared at. And Riva said that this was really important for her because she's someone who has spina bifida. It's a very visible disability. It affects the way that she moves. And so people stare at her. She's very used to being stared at and that sort of feeling that comes from being stared at. But also as a portrait artist, she's used to staring at other people, right? And so she's been on both sides of this equation. And so she made this body of work to sort of undo that power dynamic. And how she undid that is a few things. But first is she would invite people into her studio to make a portrait. They're primarily from the disability arts and activist communities, but not exclusively. In this case, it's Alice Shepherd, who's a British choreographer who uses her chair in her dance and choreography. And Riva will then spend 2 hours with them in the studio, really intense looking and conversation and crafting this portrait. But after those 2 hours, she vacates her studio and the subject is then expected to do whatever they want to the drawing. But also they can do whatever they want in the space, no questions asked, right? And so she's like, in theory, they could steal, they could break things, but it really challenges as a process our notion as like the independent artist. And I think one thing that this speaks to so nicely about disability culture is the focus on interdependence. You know, two people come to craft this drawing, it's collaborative, and that's so much what people say in the disability community, our community, is that interdependence is actually something that we should be striving for as a culture, not this idea that we all need to be fully independent, but sort of building these communities and lines of interdependence. And this drawing is just this beautiful example of that. So Riva did the figuration and also the curtains that you see, and then those sort of rainbow color foot-like feet that you see sort of cascading down from the upper left. That was Alice's contribution. She also did these doodles that you see throughout. And then Riva, after Alice finishes, is given the task to sort of finish the drawing. So there's this way that they both inform each other, but then also Riva includes Alice as part of the maker in the tombstone information. So this is an incredible drawing. It doesn't do it any justice to see it on the screen. So I do hope that you can join in the galleries for a tour or come on your own to see it. But the last thing I want to talk about is a little bit of the ways that we've thought about access for this exhibition, and also why access is so important and meaningful. This is a post that came up after I just opened the exhibition in early February by Pharah Garland, who is a Providence-based artist who also identifies as disabled. And I'm just highlighting her post, and I'm just going to put in bold some of the lines I would like you to maybe look at as we're looking at this. But she was, she just expressed how excited she was to see a show that centered her identity because she had never seen that before. But what I also love is that she's as much as she is celebratory, she's also highlighting some problems too, which is, the feeling that it was like to be in a gallery about an exhibition about disability as someone who is using a mobility device, sort of people staring at her, staring at the artwork. Again, that stare, like we think of Riva Lara was also investigating with her practice, and pity. So again, I mean that charity model sort of traffics in pity and sort of being pitiable. And it's something I think always to think about when we're centering these. But what I also love is that she says, I need systems and culture-wide progress, and for disability, chronic illness not to be treated like a moral failing. And I think doing work like this, where we center disability experience, disability identity, disability perspective, either in a very literal way like this exhibition, or in the ways that we show the exhibition. And so just briefly with my time left, I'll say some very sort of easy ways that we thought about accessibility with the exhibition is our labels are larger than we've ever done before. That makes it easier for so many people to read, including myself, who have rather normative sight. So just thinking about these easy access points. Also, we chose a font that was more dyslexic friendly. There is no such thing as one font that's friendly for all people with dyslexia. But again, thinking about these really low bar ways that make spaces more accessible. And then also even our hanging height is 58 inches from center, which is slightly lower than what we normally do at the RISD Museum. And that's also because it's in general easier for many people to look down than it is to look up. It's not true for everyone, but just thinking about these really, sort of low-hanging fruit for achieving accessibility. And I am at 20 minutes, so I will stop there. And thank you so much. And I look forward to the rest of today and any questions that you might have for me.
Thank you, Conor. That was really wonderful. And just to reiterate, please come to one of the tours if you can. I dropped a link in the chat for you all to RSVP. Just to clarify, because I just made an edit to make sure this was clear. The tours are tomorrow, Thursday, April 28th from 3 to 5 p.m. or Saturday, May 7th from 2 to 4 p.m. And again, I'll drop the link to the chat again. I'm going to go ahead and pull up the PowerPoint presentation for Jeannine now, but thank you very much, Conor.
And as Conor said, the show will be up through the summer. So if you can't make one of these exhibits that he is specifically doing for us, please drop us an email, a line. There may be another time, for example, more towards the fall after we get through the mayhem of summer, that would work for us to, set up another time. I think about where the arts and health other groups are that RISCA is sponsoring could also maybe come on a tour. If you are working for an organization or with an organization that specifically does visual art or gallery shows and want to bring maybe your board of directors or somebody to this, please be in touch with me and we can work out something about that. And before we leave this slide, I just wanted to point out this graphic that we have at the bottom, because this is some of what we're talking about with equality versus equity versus social justice. And in the first image, we see that there has been a solid wall built, a barrier, so that people, and perhaps intentionally, were not able to see the game that was being played. And so boxes were dragged in to stand upon to see if we could see over the fence. And so with everybody getting one box, it worked definitely for one guy, sort of for the middle guy, but certainly not for the third person. So that would be equality. Everyone would get the exact same thing. Everyone would get the exact same box. They're being treated equally. In the second image, we see that the boxes have switched so that equity is giving people the supports that they need. So the first guy doesn't necessarily need that box, but the third person might need two of those boxes. So they are being provided equal access to the game, but by not having all the same supports, by often having different supports. And then in the third place is where we talk actually about social justice. And is there really the need to have that barrier in place? And if we put up a fence that you could see through, no actual other supports would be needed. Everybody would be able to have access to it. So this ties into a lot of the ways we're trying to advance our thinking, from going from equality into equity, but then moving towards social justice. So for example, when Conor speaks about the size font that he uses on the wall and the type that he uses and the hanging level is always something in exhibits we take into consideration so that we can make it the most accessible for anyone who comes through the door, and we don't have to create specific plans for who will need the best boxes. We can forget the boxes and just welcome everybody from where they come. And I'm going to go on to the next one, but just as a side note, while Todd is doing that, I want to mention that in addition to looking for greater understanding about disability and what this whole topic is, a number of people also wrote that They really wanted organized checklists. They want to have a checklist. They want to feel that they can go down a checklist and see like that this is something that is important. So here is maybe the size point, whatever, 14 fonts, that really is the best. I'm making that up, but or what color it should be. And we will provide you with those checklists. We're working on all of that. That will come along in the resource materials. There will be things about, so if you're going to redo your bathroom, this really is the number of feet and inches that you have. So yeah, so that's going to be okay. You'll get your checklists along with this this other storytelling kind of piece. So to just extend a little bit Conor's point, I'm going to show you a few pop culture stereotypes, because it's really important to recognize the ways in which people with disabilities are seen in our culture. And basically, we are either a victim, we are an innocent, we are a villain, we can be a supercrip, and unfortunately, there's better off dead, but we are making progress. And I pulled out this little side note that's about women on this, just a minute, young lady. So when you get your monthly period, are you going to be suicidal? And maybe these drugs can help you. Or, men, are you having problems? Your wife has such nerves, she can't get in that kitchen to make you dinner for you and the boss that you're bringing home. Well, here's some drugs that you can give her. So women have also had a separate place, sexism, within this disability world. And if we think that these are old ideas that no longer apply to us, I ask to take a second and think about every time a woman tries to run for a political office. One of the questions that always comes up is whether or not she will have the hormonal balance to be trusted with the nuclear codes, because it can't be assumed that that would be a given, that she would be able to deal with those things. So sexism has always had a really heavy hand on top of disability and how that gets complicated. So we'll move on now towards the victim. And as Conor mentioned, the charity model is huge, huge, huge in the victim. I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember the Jerry Lewis telethon, but it took place every Labor Day, every year, and everybody participated. And Jerry brought out kids that were really, you could have pity on, you could feel sad for, he would kiss them on their heads. Isn't it great that they even got to the show? And of course, raising money, and raising money is a great thing. I run a nonprofit. I am all about raising money for sure, but it's just a matter of which you raise it. And so the victim always portrays that people with disabilities are helpless specifically because of their disability. And so the public reacts to this stereotype by treating that person with a disability like an object of pity. I've walked with crutches my whole life. Can I tell you what happened every December when all the versions of A Christmas Carol rolled out? Still to this day at Christmas time, I can be walking around on a aisle at Job Lot, and someone will come up to me and say, "Oh, I'm so sorry for you, but God help us all, everyone." So it's not like these things are old-timey things of the past. These things, again, have gotten in the groundwater and live with us and live with every time that all of these shows like A Christmas Carol and The Glass Menagerie get brought up. So then we'll move on to the next one, which I think is The Innocent. Todd? Yes, The Innocent. Okay, so The Innocent. So that stereotype is the character that has an intellectual disability and is portrayed as childlike, obviously dependent on others. The intellectually disabled character is very guileless, is very innocent, and their innocence and their simplicity confers goodness on others around them. So this stereotype explains why people with intellectual disabilities, developmental disabilities, so often out in the world are automatically treated like children. They could be 40, 50 years old, and you recognize that they have a disability, and yet the people around them will treat them like a child, will not talk to them, but may talk to their care attendant. A good example of this is what we've seen in these movies, Finding Dory, which Dory came out of Nemo as the simple-minded character that could help them find Nemo. Tom Hanks in Forrest Gump was huge. And Dustin Hoffman in Rain Man was also huge. And this particular one of Rain Man will play out across several different stereotypes. But now we're going to go into the villain, Todd. So yeah, some people with disabilities are portrayed as overtly innocent. However, lots of us are portrayed as angry and bitter. And we are forever angry because we were burdened with this disability. And so the villain stereotype is really dangerous and evil. And usually that grows right out of their having a disability. It's the Phantom of the Opera. It's the Joker. Of course, it's Darth Vader. He's just, you know, such a bad guy. And then later on in the stories of how Star Wars plays out, we find out why. The albino villain in Da Vinci Code. Over here on the left is Richard III. Richard III, along with oh God, I just threw a blank. Oh, the Glass Menagerie and Tiny Tim are like the triumvirate of disabled characters in the 30s. Kevin Spacey and Richard III. He also has a tendency to love playing these kind of characters and other things. I don't know if you remember his portrayal of Verbal Flint in The Usual Suspects, but he wins Academy Awards for playing these disabled characters. And it comes down into, oh, here's Dustin Hoffman playing Captain Hook. So he also really likes playing these characters that he sees on the edge. And the reason they're on the edge is because they're having disabilities just gives these actors so much, you know, to work with. Except for as people with disabilities, when we watch these things and we see that they get Academy and other awards, I have to tell you, we don't think that they're brilliant acting portrayals. We think that maybe they're brilliant portrayals of what people without disabilities think people with disabilities are. But at their core, we don't understand why these always get so many Academy and other awards, because we don't see them as being all that brilliant. And even in cartoons, so we have Captain Hook down in the lower right, and up here on the top left, we have Scar from The Lion King. They couldn't even be bothered to give these characters actual names. I don't know, Harvey or something else. They could only get as far as saying, oh, well, he's Captain Hook. Oh, well, he's Scar. Why else would they need any other kind of definition? So villains, yeah, villains play a lot out in the world. And then there's the supercrip. And the supercrip is someone who is portrayed as having overcome their disability, despite the fact that nothing about their body has changed. They've overcome their disability by accomplishing exceptional feats. And in a way, this stereotype is used to silence us as other people with disabilities by pointing out, well, look how much these people with disabilities have achieved. Therefore, the playing field has to be level, right? It's only that you're not trying hard enough in order to be viewed as being able-bodied, normal. If they could put this effort into it, you could also. And so, for example, in The Miracle Worker, Helen Keller is deaf and blind. Sadly enough, when she actually grew up in real life, she was diminished to the point where she had to earn a living by working on the vaudeville circuit and traveling around and having people in the audience ask her questions so she could answer questions to them through Annie, and therefore prove that she was normal because she could have some level of intellect. Same thing with Elephant Man. And also same thing with the theory of everything, that despite how incredibly diminished he could be with his disabilities, he could still just be a brilliant person. And the other way that that happens is in comic strips like Daredevil, where everyone thought, oh, he's lost his sight, he's a lawyer, he'll be able to get by. But no, he doesn't stop there, because he develops his other senses so amazing that he can hear beyond even what normal people can hear. And so the message being sent here is that being disabled, regardless of what your disability is not something that you should ever be happy about. You need to find a redeeming quality in yourself so you can overcome your perceived disability and prove to others that you're not just disabled. And so unfortunately, that leads us to the better off dead, which is just what it says, that being disabled is so terrible, it really would be just better off dead. These movies, these stories, they are presented as these gigantic romantic stories. Oh my, you know, Ali McGraw, love means never having to say you're sorry. And so she sacrifices herself, and it's so romantic when she dies at the end. Same thing with Julia Roberts and dying young. And a couple of years ago, this movie came out that was Not Dead Yet, where this gentleman in a wheelchair actually spent all his time convincing everyone that his sacrifice, he had a lot of money, his sacrifice was better off to be dead. He could give this woman all his money and she could have a much happier life than she could actually have if he stayed alive. So we must suffer and then eventually die or kill ourselves. So obviously that message is the disabled life is not a life worth living. And what you might have noticed out of all of these things, and you can stay right there, Todd, because I'll get to that, is that all of those people, none of them were played by actual people with disabilities. At least 98% of all disabled roles go to non-disabled individuals. Now, I think most of us would agree that if a movie called for a Black or an Asian actor, then they would cast somebody who was Black or Asian to play that person, right? I mean, it no longer makes sense for us in our culture to do blackface. It would be so offensive to have a white person dress up as Black or Asian and play the role, even though that has happened in our history, in our past, except for this happens to people with disabilities all the time. And finally, we're making some movement in that. These top two pictures are from the movie Coda, which may have a few plot points that the disability community has problems with, but the fact that they actually cast people who are deaf to play these roles was huge. And so to actually award the Oscar to Tony as the best supporting actor for playing a role that was authentic to him was amazing. You've probably seen Peter Dinklage in Game of Thrones, where he has won many awards for, including Golden Globes. And this is Ali Stroker. She won the Tony for the last rendition of Oklahoma, which was a phenomenal production done in New York on Broadway. And she played Annie. I'm just a girl who can't say no in a wheelchair. And it was just as valid to see her playing that woman as it was any other actress. And they recognized it and gave her the Tony. So it's great that we're catching a break and that these people are now actually getting cast as places, people. And yeah, so we all get to now catch a break. This is our moment to do some adulting and take whatever. Todd, what do you say? And we'll be back.
I think let's take 5 minutes. So let's be back at, we'll be back at 12:05. And then we'll start it again. So make 7 minutes, 12:05.
Okay.
And turn on, for those of you who have your cameras on, if you can turn them back on when you come, that way we just know you're back.
Okay. Todd, are you there?
Yes, I'm here. Hold on one second. And take it away whenever you're ready.
All right. So, yeah, I've written down some notes to go through this. The new meds I'm on sometimes makes my brain a little glitchy, and I want to make sure I get things right. So we're going to go into, now that we've seen sort of where we've been and what we've been surrounded with, we've seen how we got to where we are. Now, how do we get further? And where did we get to that RISCA is now saying, okay, programs, access. So you really start to see changes in the mid-20th century, where we get into people doing self-advocacy. Those of us with disabilities are saying we need to improve. And we take a lot of our cues from the civil rights movement at this point. And in the 1990s, in the self-advocacy movement in the disability and autism world in particular, as well as, I must say, AIDS activism was really also very involved with this. And there's some things in Conor's Variance show that go into that you will be very interested in. And so you get to see the start of emergence of this idea that the focus should not just be on fixing the causes, fixing the individual, but instead on understanding how we can make all people's lives better, regardless of their different characteristics and their different disabilities. So in the disability rights earlier stages, we got all of this legislation passed, which head into going to Congress, and it got stalled in Congress. The legislature didn't want to deal with it. It just sat there forever. And this was called the Americans with Disabilities Act. And the ADA defines a person with a disability as a person who has a physical or mental impairment that substantially limits one or more major life activity. So this includes people who have a record of such impairment, even if they do not currently have a disability. And it makes it unlawful to discriminate against a person based on either that person's association with a person with a disability or having it themselves. And remember, this is a law. In the context of ADA, disability is a legal term rather than a medical one. So, you know, Social Security, disability, and other related benefits don't necessarily fall under this. But what happened was everybody got sick of them not being willing to pass this law. So activists came from throughout the United States down to Washington on March 13, 1990. And they took themselves out of their wheelchairs, put their crutches aside, and literally crawled up the steps of the Capitol, which was the only way to get in the building. I'm telling you, there were no elevators, there was no nothing. And of course, this garnered a whole lot of press. That young woman who you see, I forget if she was 8 or 9 years old, but here she is spending her day crawling up the steps, being interviewed, saying to the press that these people in this building are making all the decisions about my life, but I can't get in the building to even talk to them. I can't get in the building to do anything about it. And so frankly, fortunately, the legislators were so embarrassed at how we all made them look that they actually signed the ADA. So the ADA was signed into law on July 26th. So they still had a debate about it between March and July, but we got that passed, and that was huge. And so the ADA not only changed the law about how people must be treated within a workplace, but it also began to shift American culture surrounding disabled people at large. Suddenly we had to come to terms with whether or not people with disabilities were allowed to ride on buses, were allowed to get into any place. So any of the Smithsonian places down in Washington was a huge piece of all of that. And so this law for inclusion is what is based on now what RISCA and other arts organizations and the NEA is held to. In order to spend funding, you have to comply with this law. And again, it's 32 years later, so it's more than enough time. So we are going to continue to push for equitable treatment, encouraging an end to stigma, positing that disability is a natural extension of the human experience rather than just a deficit. And how this plays out in Rhode Island is that there are 223,588 adults in Rhode Island that have a disability. 27% of the adults in Rhode Island have a disability. And I want to tell you, I think that number is small because I think there's a lot of people that they didn't reach when they did the census, a lot of people who still feel the stigma of having a disability, who don't want to disclose that they maybe have behavioral, emotional, or neurodivergent issues. So really, you know, if you thought of like 250,000 adults in Rhode Island, and now if you don't take money from RISCA, if you don't take any federal funding, you don't have to be accessible. Nobody's saying that you have to be. It's only saying that if you want to use this money to make your programs, you have to make sure that those of us that have a disability can be a part of it. And by disability, we mean physical disability, which is mobility, sensory, your vision, your hearing, behavioral, emotional, which is all kinds of psychiatric issues, and your developmental, which is cognitive learning. And as we'll talk about much deeper in our next session, that includes autism and neurodivergency. So we see there are three basic barriers that create inclusion. One is structural, and that's the architect. One is communicative, and that is not just the language you use, but how and where you use that language. And the other is attitudinal. And that's why we spend so much time going into showing you about the stigma and the attitudes, because that is the least expensive barrier. That barrier can essentially cost you nothing, but it really is the hardest one to deal with. And affects how, oh, sorry, can you go back one more second, Todd? Yeah, and affects how you look at the structural and communicative. For example, communicative could be how you're talking about things on your website. So if on your website, you're saying that you are a radical organization and that you are cutting edge, but then I look at the rest of your website and I find out that your entrance isn't accessible and you don't have an accessible bathroom, then I go, how can they be thinking they're radical? I can't even go into their place. Same thing with structural architectural. Places got all kinds of money at the beginning of the take it outside pandemic world. And yet, okay, we're going to build a big platform outside so people don't have to come into our building any longer. And what did they do? Somebody went and built a lovely stage platform that had 3 places where you could access the top of the platform. All 3 places had stairs. One of them could have easily been a ramp and 2 of them could have been stairs, but because they didn't have the right attitude about what they were doing, they didn't think about it. So all of these things are very, very interwoven, and that's why we're going to need to talk next about intersectionalism. Thank you, Todd. So these are my 3 intersectional goddesses. Gloria, like all people, we perceive the version of reality that our culture communicates. Like others having or living in more than one culture, we get multiple, often opposing messages. So yes, it's confusing and it's difficult, even within the disability community. Audre Lorde says, there's no such thing as a single issue struggle because we do not have single issue lives. And that's because intersectionality and disability cross over race, ethnicity, class, gender, sexuality, and disability. And Kimberly Crenshaw, who actually coined the term intersectionality in 1989. She says this idea that we all have the same life is false. Race, class, gender come together to shape the life chances of different people in very different ways. So from linking social class to feeble-mindedness in the 1920s and 30s, to cultural deficit and culture of poverty discourses in the 50s and 60s, to contemporary discussions about achievement gaps in our education. We have a huge overrepresentation of students of color in special education, and that's due to all kinds of economic inequality, race, and disability. These things have been so entangled in an ongoing, complicated relationship that we need to unpack a bunch of that. Again, that groundwater that's in everything, we have to figure that out. So when I first heard about Kimberly Crenshaw's concept of intersectionality, I misunderstood it. And I want to say a little bit about what I got wrong, because I think it's important. And I think what I've come to learn since is really critical and crucial about intersectionality and how these things are, like oppression, are woven together. And I don't believe we can fight or heal what we can't understand or articulate. So we all have experiences and privileges based on where we stand in that intersection. When I first learned about intersectionality, I thought the concept was this: each of us come from a particular standpoint, which is the intersection of our various identities. Because various forms of oppression like racism, ableism, homophobia, classism play out across these identities, we all have different experiences of privilege and oppression based on where we stand. So down here in the left corner, this is my pre-COVID avatar. As you can see, there's been a change of haircut. But me seeing myself in this intersection in class and queer and ableism and intersection, I thought I had an understanding of what that meant, because each of us comes from one of those places. So for example, some of us, myself included, experience sexism. Some of us, myself included, experience sexism and ableism. Some of us experience sexism, homophobia, and racism. Not me, but you get the idea. We all come from multiple places. So my prior understanding of intersectionality was that some of us have this burden, and some of us have more burdens, and that it's important to remember sort of that number of burdens. Now I understand that that is an additive model, and that we think of is not correct. That each new ism adds on to the ones before it, compounding the experience of oppression. But at its best, the additive model is useful for remembering that not everyone's experience is like our own, for understanding we all experience some forms of privilege and some forms of oppression. And we need to keep in mind that liberation and social justice are never and never can be single issue struggles, as we talked about with Audra and Gloria. They're not. And particularly how this plays out in disability. But this additive model also sets us up for what people before me have called the oppression Olympics, the ranking of different experiences to decide who has the oppression the worst, or who wins the most oppression award in the grand arena of awfulness. And this, for starters, isn't, well, it's not the best for building empathy and coalition and solidarity if we're wondering about, is my oppression better or worse than somebody else's? So it's impossible to calculate that. Who's more oppressed? Is a Black disabled immigrant or a Native transgender male more oppressed? Well, there's no answering that question, and it's not even super useful to ask that. So delving deeper into intersectionality, which that additive model is not, I understood that because intersectionality isn't only or even mostly about how oppressions add on to each other or privileges add on to each other. In other words, it's not about what it's like to struggle with this and that. It's about what it's like to struggle with in the place where this and that are so interwoven that you can't tell them apart. So me in the intersection, I cannot tell you sometimes when I feel that some discrimination or oppression is going on out in the world, why out of these things I'm particularly being targeted, because they are so interwoven, this and that, you can't tell them apart. It's about how those multiple forms of oppression are experienced simultaneously in ways that make them inextricable, but are interwoven. So when I'm in the middle of XY intersection, I can't say whether I'm on X or Y. It's both, it's all of them, it's XY. And so Crenshaw argued that the intersection of oppressions are like this, that Black women experience racism and sexism in a way which you can't parse out where one stops and the other begins. And that racism changes the shape of the sexism. And of course, the sexism changes the shape of the racism. And what's left is a particularly virulent form of misogyny. And that's what happens with disability. So it's not one or the other, but when you outreach into communities of people with disabilities, you must be prepared for the other pieces of their culture that they will bring with them. And so the point isn't to try and figure out whose version of disability is more heinous. The point is to try and understand how ableism is operating against different populations of people so we can begin to fight for all of those together. So Crenshaw writing about the experience of Black women, but her point, I think, applies more broadly across all those axes of identity, including disability, orientation, and not just all of those individual stereotypes of the victim or the innocent. So all of those are interlocking oppressions, and you don't want to get stuck laying in the middle of that intersection, trying to figure out how to tell them which one you're being oppressed by, class or sexism or X or Y, because in the meantime, you're in the middle of the intersection bleeding out. And again, I know these ideas of disability history and intersectionality isn't as straightforward as the access checkbox list, but it's really incredibly important, especially when we get into invisible disabilities and neurodiversity, if we think about how we need these nuanced concepts of intersectionality to become as embedded in the work we do, and not just in, like I said, that oppression matrix. Because only when we start to figure out the history of these oppressions, not as a single story or a single series of stories that, well, let's face it, you know, that those interlocking stories, that we can begin to challenge them. And I'm going to say, because I almost did, that clusterfuck of intersection stories will mess us all up if we try and separate them all and really don't start to look at them as an interwoven piece. And so that's what RISCA is attempting to do with their EDI initiatives that you're participating in. And that's what I'm hoping in moving forward with RISCA and the examples that Charles will give us, we can look at to see how we can bring all of those pieces together to create better holistic programs. And so with that, I will turn it over to Todd and Charles, and we'll see where we get to next.
Thank you, Jeannine. That was excellent, as always. So there was a couple of slides we didn't get to, but these slides will be shared with a follow-up email that is sent you all, and also they'll be shared on our website as well. And we're going to touch base on those slides around language next week.
Again, come back next week and I will touch base on them.
Why wouldn't you want to spend your morning/afternoon with us? So next up is a fantastic Charles Baldwin. Charles Baldwin is a program officer for the Universal Participation Initiative up at Mass Cultural Council. Charles is a professional theater artist, educated on the streets of San Francisco and fine-tuned at Boston's Wheelock Family Theater. I also want to just give Charles another shout out. Charles is a very amazing and generous person in the field of state arts agencies. Mass Cultural Council has invested a lot of time and energy and resources wonderfully in access by having a position such as Charles. And Charles, again, supports all of us in the field. Shout out to Charles in supporting us during our changes to our project grants for organizations. Jeannine was mentioning that we have questions specific around what kind of access strategies organizations are implementing with programs are offering, adding an accessibility line item to the budget. And Charles helped us craft a list of different kinds of strategies that organizations can implement who are new to this kind of work. So I'm going to let Charles take it away from here. But again, thank you so much, Charles, for being here.
Oh, thank you so much for inviting me to share space with you today and that very generous introduction. Again, my name is Charles Baldwin. For people who are just listening in, I'm an older white gentleman with a graying beard, glasses, and a trim mohawk. I'm calling in from my studio in Somerville, which is part of the unceded lands of the Massachusetts Nipmuc and Wampanoag peoples. The presentation that I've got today, we'll talk a little bit about the UP program, Up for Universal Participation. I asked Todd to mention both the streets of San Francisco and my time at Wheelock Family Theater, because they really both inform this work. I was an activist, well, I was a waiter / activist in San Francisco for many years, and that kind of work definitely informed how I view the world today. And at Wheelock Family Theater, its commitment to inclusion, which started in 1981, was considered radical in 1981. Sadly, it's sort of still a little radical, but it really is the norm when thinking about the barriers of ability, race, and class and gender. So let me find my slideshow here and we can begin. Alrighty, and again, thank you all very much for participating in this today. We'll go briefly through a couple of these up for universal participation. The image here is of Elise Patterson, who has made her mark in Massachusetts in the last 5 years. She started a company called Abilities Dance Boston. She is a young woman who uses a wheelchair sometimes, uses a walker sometimes, uses a cane sometimes, and sometimes has been told that she's not disabled enough. Briefly, because I am wearing my Mass Cultural Council vest, the power of culture is our hashtag, our quick line, but really about investing in the cultural sector of Massachusetts. And UP started in 2015. When it started that first year, I was a little critical of it. I am a theater person, so I like to turn words into action. Here is an image also taken during the protests of 1990. Most of these images that you might see are by the photographer Tom Olin. Here we have activists protesting access to public transportation with a quote from Martin Luther King on a banner: "Injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere." The UP initiative is really about helping organizations understand that access can be a shorthand, but that access both anticipates and responds to real humans and provides choices and opportunities. The characteristics that we look for in an organization that is joining the UP initiative are tied to vision, education, representation, and innovation. Sometimes small words, but how you respond to those lets us know where you might be on that spectrum of understanding. UP is both a learning network and opportunities for funding. I won't stay in the statistics too long, but at this point, I will say I am not a person who identifies as a person with a disability, but I am a person who identifies as old. And the disabling nature of age has certainly changed how I move, hear, and see. As Jeannine pointed out, the percentages of people who identify as having a disability is 1 in 5, 20%. I agree with you, though, it's probably closer to 25%. Many people do not identify their functional limitations as a disability. Sometimes they need to see them larger and broader. I think the statistic about young people between the ages of 30 and 21 at 13% is something to note. Most of these are brain-based disabilities. And then, of course, the aging population, that silver tsunami of that's what's coming down the pike, has 10,000 people turning 65 every day. But you'll note on this slide, the two images I use are the classic international symbol of disability, the stick figure in the wheelchair, and then, of course, the Sarah Hendren designed gorilla version that is not federally recognized, but that shows a more active stick figure in a rolling wheelchair. This has been very successful, but it does tend to make people think about disability in a very physical way. And some of the most common functional limitations that may prevent a person from dealing with day-to-day living, the chores that are needed to get it through the day, are things like arthritis and back problems and heart disease, things that are not visible, that still allow you to use the ADA parking, but might also get you yelled at because you do not have a visible disability. As noted, when we're talking about the biases around this very concept of disability, which is really a small word for a large umbrella of conditions and identities, behaviors, temporary, cognitive, it's vast. But this phrase disability touches everybody. And this is important to remember also, that not everyone with a disability necessarily wants or needs assistance, and people who might have quote unquote the same disability may not need the same things. But I do like this image because this image of the astronaut in outer space is a reminder that disability occurs at that point where the human meets the environment. This space outfit is universally designed to allow a human to exist in a very inhumane space. And so in outer space, everyone is disabled. I've included here also the acronym that many of us are using, the D, the E, and the I. I put it, of course, together in that very clever way that spells idea, thinking about inclusion as an action, not just something that's writ in a mission, but it's an active verb. Diversity is really an acknowledgement of the real world around us. If you don't see that, again, you're not in the real world. Striving for equity is the aspiration. This idea of fairness and that distribution sometimes needs to occur in a manner that will, again, create a more equitable state, more equitable opportunities. And I really believe that access as an action, as a system, is something that can be achievable by design. And so while universal design has 7 principles, I'm a fan of the 8 goals as designed by Edward Steinfeld at the University of Buffalo, because the 8 goals of universal design include the things like body fit and comfort, awareness and understanding, but I like that wellness is part of this. We move quickly away from the medical model, but our own health and wellness is super important. And certainly many people who took to remote work and the isolating atmosphere that could created a real understanding of the disabling nature of that and the importance of our own health and wellness so that we can contribute. I also am a fan of cultural appropriateness in these 8 goals of universal design, because it really is about respecting and reinforcing the cultural values of a project. I won't go deeply into universal design for learning, but this is really brain-based and an understanding of how understanding of how the brain works so that we can achieve maximum success for anyone who may be taking our class. I like to include this when I am talking to folks in the marketing department, because really what we're talking about is how do we inform people, and an understanding of how people take in information can be really strategically important when you're thinking about how you inform them. As noted, I am not an expert in the ADA, nor am I the ADA police. And although I do work for a funder, and I now have about 88 organizations that have joined the network, with another 12 coming in at the end of May, I am a great encourager. I'm the theater guy that wants to encourage people to put on a show. The idea that once you join up, you can never really leave. But I break the ADA down into these concepts that can seem abstract, which is what makes the ADA as complicated as it is. But this idea of reasonable accommodations, the idea of what is reasonable. The goal is integrated settings, mostly, because sometimes specific populations would like specific settings. The phrase effective communication, Jeannine mentioned this before, but what is effective? What is effective for me may not necessarily be effective for Jeannine. So it really means that you want to both, again, to anticipate and respond, but it's this holistic perspective to really understanding how to develop an accessible infrastructure for your institution. The idea of having a center person. Now, the NEA does require this, and you'll be getting into the requirements and obligations under the ADA, certainly at a future date, but that central person who is able to gather information and share information. I have the privilege of being that person at the Mass Cultural Council and not being, well, although I do wear many hats, they're all because Access touches every department, internal and external, at the Mass Cultural Council. And a key part of this is centering the user. That's kind of a design term, but it really is this idea of with me, not for me. Don't be making assumptions about the people that you're hoping to serve. It's always best to ask people. I'm not going to go into undue burden. It does touch upon budgeting. And if you are unable to comply with a reasonable accommodation, you really have to understand what an undue burden is. And in my estimation, where Jeannine was saying, if you're not accepting federal money, you don't have to do it. I, on the other hand, think you have to do it. I mean, if you're not including everybody, then you're excluding a segment of the population. And exclusion is very not a place where anyone wants to be.
That's because we go for the spirit of the law, not just the letter.
Exactly. And as I said, I'm not the ADA police. I have a lot of DIY efforts for organizations that join up. I really have to work hard to get them through the idea that, oh, I'm with a funder, I've got to wear my bow tie, best foot forward, and really dig in, because so much of this is built on a candid assessment of where you are. So this first step that you might take to developing an accessible infrastructure really is one of integrity, and one that will sustain, and one that will lead to a second step. As Jeannine mentioned, attitude is the most affordable, so staff training. And that is something that can't be one and done. Not only do staff change, particularly your frontline staff are often younger staff on the move, and yet they are the key personnel that needs to be both informed as to what you have, what you provide, but also empowered to make a decision. There's nothing worse than being told, wait. People with disabilities have been told to wait for a very long time. As I mentioned before, the ADA coordinator, that central person becomes key, but that central person needs to have access to all the other departments. You'll be talking about people first language at a future time at the next visit, but language, like everything, is nuanced. I think of people first language as the default position, but as you get to know people, those definitions may change, because again, a lot of this work is more nuanced. You can start with the checklist, that very wanted, needed, infamous checklist, but from there you got to blow it out, because the checklist will only get you so far. I start with customer service. For organizations that have joined up and gone through this learning network, which is it's about 40 hours over the course of 15 weeks, with the goal, again, of building this access infrastructure. And often the first step that, once you've gone through this, new funds are available to you. It's like an access equity point. So once you've gone through the work, then you have access to new monies. And often people will start with staff training. And this, again, this idea that it needs to be ongoing. You'll see in the fourth section, I put transactional or transformational. This is something that, again, can be very nuanced when you're thinking about the staff and its relationship to patronage. Does an organization serve people, or is an organization in community with people? Again, it can sound like wordplay and that I'm just wordsmithing, but it does tie to a vision. And what does an organization do? How does it exist in community? We talk about belonging a lot. How is that achieved? And I don't know if it's achieved just by serving people. I think it's achieved by working with people. The last thing to note under this customer service is a grievance procedure. You can have everything on your website and all the information, but some people just like to pick up the phone and make a phone call. You do want to have that one person. And again, under the ADA and the obligations, you need to be prepared if someone has a grievance. Again, unpacking this idea of effective communication. What is effective? The image here is from an event that Mass Audubon held. Mass Audubon has a number of properties across the state of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts, and they have really been working to create more accessible trails, utilizing tactile experiences as a communication tool. The image here shows actually a series of pictographs that are tactile that will then identify different regions of this outdoor fair. So this tactile slide, this tactile plate is recreated in another environment so that the person can tell by touch if they're in the spot they want to be in. You'll note at the bottom of the image of the person touching these tactile plates are a series of logos. These logos should be used as often as possible. Obviously, they pertain to real live actions, real live services that you might or hopefully will consider providing. The question mark, of course, for frequently asked questions is very popular, but as we go down the line, the two hands refer to American Sign Language. Is this something that you offer regularly? Is this something that you offer at select performances or events? Third image is the infamous wheelchair. Fourth image shows a stick figure using a cane. This is an opportunity to let folks who have limited vision or who are blind, that either you have sighted guide techniques or services that will support them with their cane. Perhaps it might even be a tactile path they can feel with the cane to get from point A to B. I like to include the Braille insignia. At Wheelock, we did a lot with Braille. We know with the rise of audio equipment and audio solutions that Braille isn't used as much, and it's certainly not by older folks who might be losing some of their vision or having their vision change over time. But Braille for young people, I think, is critically important. Braille is about reading, and reading is about brain development. CC and OC, the next logos, closed captions versus open captions. Closed captions, I'm the only one who sees them. Open captions, everyone has a chance to see them. And then large print. Large print is one of those very simple things that can be done along with hanging an image slightly lower or having a large label visible so that I don't need my reading glasses to read it. Large print is generally 18 or above size font, and that's something that you can do in a Word doc and a printer very easily. There's a long list of things that go from large print to emojis. Each of these have communication tactics. So sometimes it doesn't have to be big and technical, and it can be as simple as the text you are sending right now to your friend about this great presentation that RISCA is doing. I have a number of organizations that have received funds for ASL interpreting a performance or a lecture. This can be complicated, and I might not even be in agreement with my wonderful colleagues in the room. Which comes first, the person or the accommodation? Often when, particularly if you're, say, a venue that is hosting an event and you want to put an ASL interpreter so that perhaps people who are deaf, and again, people who are deaf who use ASL would come to your event. In a performance setting, this is what was happening at Wheelock Family Theater, we would hire a director of ASL who would be a person who is deaf, so that the interpretation of the production was came from an authentic user of the language. And then the person who was deaf, who was the director of ASL, would hire the ASL interpreters. And again, I'm not going to answer this question, but I will tell you, whenever I hear, I couldn't take my eyes off the ASL interpreter, and when that is said by a hearing person, then I believe the interpreter has stolen the focus. I'm just going to let that drop there, and we can talk about it later. Up action, part of the ADA is integrated settings. Here I've used an image from VSA Mass, which is now known as Open Door Massachusetts, Open Door Arts Massachusetts. They did an inclusive by design concert. This really started with a woman named Lisa Thorson, who is a professor at Berklee College of Music, where the music was interpreted by a painter. The music was interpreted by ASL interpreters. So again, not interpreting words, but interpreting the sounds of the music. And then a live audio description. So an audio description that everyone could hear in the audience, not just people who chose to select this service. Everyone heard the description that was happening on the stage. The painter painting, the signer signing, the pianist playing. It's a pretty wild night. Creating these integrated settings is the goal, but as is known, particularly when we're thinking about language-based programs, sometimes people want to be with their people. I've included digital access, and through the UP program, we have provided funding for a lot of organizations to improve their website. We know the website is the front door to many of your organizations. How accessible is your website? And so much of this is knowing what to ask. I'm no contractor, but I know what to ask to let me know if the contractor is either just meeting obligations or understanding access as something bigger and broader than just the checklist of obligations. And this is what can sometimes happen in these digital environments, our websites, our social media. WCAG, which is the Web Consortium Accessibility Guidelines, we're at 2.1. And this is something that you can certainly look up on the web, but it is really important to be thinking about your websites. Can they be navigated with a screen reader? Can they be navigated purely with the keyboard? These are things that you can try for yourself, but it's really great to have a user to determine just how accessible is your website. Some things are much more affordable. Yeah, websites are tough and require often outside consultants, but sometimes things really can be done affordably, which is why this graphic here just shows a pen, a pencil, and paper. When we would have large audiences of deaf patrons at Wheelock Family Theater, often our early volunteers, our new volunteers might panic. Oh, what am I going to do? And then I would hand them a piece of paper and a pen and say, you'll be fine. That really can work. It's not the best, but it does work. Using descriptive language that is different than information language. Audio description in a performance setting is choreographed description that will describe elements in the production that will help either elevate the story or push the story along. Service animals would be considered auxiliary aids, and if you're like many other groups, we could spend all day on service animals. There are, again, you are obliged to accept service animals. So it's great if you say that you do, because again, you are obliged to. I would suggest that you really consider creating policies around emotional support animals. People have them. They are not protected under the ADA. The ADA is specifically about an animal that has been trained to perform a task that will support you and enhance the life of someone with a disability. Emotional support animals are not trained. They are providing what they want, but you will want to create some sort of policy when someone shows up with an animal they say is not a service animal, but is an emotional support animal. Mobility devices of all kinds. You really need to be considering everything from the push-me wheelchair to the very heavy motorized wheelchair to what's the mobility device? The segways. Wheels, 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 all these things with wheels, really something to be prepared for and to consider. Assistive listening systems for any of you that have a place of assembly that has microphone sound, mic'd sound, you need to have sound amplification devices, often called assisted listening systems. So again, an obligation, but there are ways to go above and beyond. Braille and large print. Think about, we did a lot of backstage tours, and within that backstage tours, multiple senses were part of the experience, so people could touch and smell. It wasn't too much tasting backstage, but think about your senses as a communication tool and not just as a sort of a sideline, but something that actually creates information. This physical access, of course, is what everyone thinks about when we're thinking about architecture. I do sometimes think that I seem to be always at odds with the historical societies because nothing can change for the integrity of the historic relevance. That being said, London has done a lot, but the ADA does list things in Massachusetts. It's the Massachusetts Architectural Advisory Board. That is what contractors and builders need to understand. I just want to say that the designer needs to make the ramp beautiful. A big project at the start of the UP program was the Worcester Arts Museum putting in a ramp on their historic entrance. The Worcester Art Museum's traditional entrance was like a ziggurat of steps, and you weren't even quite sure what was the most direct path to get to it. But they put in this beautiful ramp. Everyone celebrated it. Everyone could go in via this ramp. It was beyond ADA compliance, and it was at the front door. Great. Subsequently, they've removed the ziggurat of steps. They put in a beautiful staircase and an elevator, and it's all beautiful, except I did note the elevator is kind of hidden behind the staircase. So you'll see in this third thing that I think is really important when we're thinking about physical access is wayfinding. Wayfinding is more than just signage. It certainly includes signage. But if I'm going to your front door and I'm using a wheeled device, and at your front door, then I see a sign that lets me know that the ramp is at the back door, perhaps there should have been some information where I parked, so I didn't have to roll all the way up to the front door. So wayfinding, the way people move through a space, I think is super important. And I always tell my organizations that are part of UP, think about your place not as a static environment, but as a dynamic environment. How do you get there and how do you leave? One of the things I also think is super important when thinking about the physical environment is to remember the various ways people move and think and hear and see in an emergency. We know in tall buildings that rely upon elevators, people with disabilities are going to be told to wait. So is there a way to bypass that? So just something to be thinking about and to be sure to include a variety of people with disabilities in your emergency plan procedures and any kind of fire drills that you might have. Many of you, you're talking about neurodiversity, cognition disabilities, the diagnosis of autism, Asperger's. The relaxed performance, the modified performance is certainly one that's caught the attention of many. There are different ways to do this. At Wheelock Family Theater, we did 2 modified performances for our audience members with autism, and then not too many people came, and we surveyed everybody because we were like, why aren't people coming? And the audience that we had designated these specific performances for told us they were already coming, so that the environment that we had created was one they felt comfortable coming to any show. And so with that, we modified some of the extras we had at every performance so that the staff was trained to recognize and respect a variety of people who may be in the audience. Fidget toys or focus toys were available at every single performance. A quiet space or a chill out room was available at every single performance. So there are ways to go about this in letting people know what to expect or modifying it to sort of de-sharpen some of the edges of a performance. You'll note that under social narratives, I put in parentheses, social stories and Carol Gray. The social narrative is a step-by-step breakdown about what someone might experience coming to your institution. I think it's important to know that social stories, which are specifically rooted in IEPs, is a copywritten. Carol Gray has copywritten these, so social stories should not be used casually when you're providing social narratives at your event. And as I said, while the integrated setting may be something that we are striving for the relaxed performance, people want to be with people and families like themselves, which helps eliminate some of the stigma of making noise or moving about, not having the lights darkened. These are things that a modified performance can certainly support. And strategic partnerships, when thinking about, is this relaxed performance, is this modified performance just for people with autism? I think we sometimes get stuck in providing services and enhancements for a specific type of person. And really what we want to be creating are opportunities for people to choose. If you let folks know what the relaxed performance is, this modified performance, then they can choose to come with their little one. They can choose to come with their friend who may not have autism, but Down syndrome, or whatever the diagnosis might be, that might, a relaxed performance environment may be more inviting. We'll touch
Just so
upon.
you know, Charles, we will be going in our next week's thing, we will be going into social narratives and what they are and how they
Oh,
work.
good. I just always get worried
detail.
when I see the phrase social stories, because I know those, Carol owns that.
And I will say, Charles, we're at time now, but so if people need to leave, please, by all means, you will get a recording of this workshop later on in a follow-up email today or tomorrow. But yeah, Charles, if you want to go on as comfortably as you can, that'll be great. I know we didn't get chance for questions and answers when I sent out the follow-up email.
All the time. I'm so sorry, Tom.
Okay. No, it's fine. But folks, when I send out the follow-up email, feel free to follow up with questions, and that's something that we can figure out how to best answer those either through email or at the session that's coming up next week.
Talked about intersectional. I'm going to briefly touch upon essential disability aesthetics being something that I think is emerging, and our connection, as was noted, to access when we're thinking about food and water, housing and transportation, medical health and wellness. Again, be thinking of our sites as places that are dynamic, not static, places that you come to and you will leave from. There's some resources which Trout will share in the after effect, and I really thought I was on time.
You were remarkably close, Charles. You did great.
I was so close, man. So
And
close.
as you said too, all those resources are things that I can share with everyone, and we'll be putting also on our resource page and be crediting Mass Cultural Council with sharing those resources with us. Again, we really appreciate that. We really, as a very small arts agency in a really mighty but small state, we rely on the support of our fellow colleagues in getting this work done. And
you know, and I put this in the chat, and I mean it. And this was when I was at Wheelock too. This idea that everything is competitive because there's not enough to go around. We're empowered when we come together as a coalition. That's where our power is. And that's why, whether it's a theater group or a museum group or a historic group, any access group becomes a community of practice if we can stitch this together so that it alleviates the weight of step one. And that's, I really believe that.
Great. Yeah, excellent point to end on. Thank you, Charles. So thank you all for being here today. Thank you to my friend and colleague, Jeannine Chartier, for organizing this workshop.
Todd?
Yes.
Was there any particular question that came up in the chat that needs to be addressed, or is there any sort of burning query that anybody has that, you know, before we send people away, I wouldn't want them to go away feeling like,
yeah,
you know, this was sitting on them?
Yeah, there wasn't anything that came up in the chat, so I'll just invite people to respond with questions when I send the follow-up survey as well, and that might inform what we talk about next week. But thank you again to Jeannine and Arts Equity Rhode Island for organizing these, and a very special thank you to Conor and Charles for being with us today, sharing their great work and just sharing their great personalities as well. Thank you all for being here. Have a wonderful afternoon, and we'll hopefully see you.
So nice seeing everybody. Thank you all so much. And again, rewatch stuff during the week. If you want to reach out, if you have a question that later on comes up to you, feel free to reach out to us and let me get back to you while we're waiting for this next week's to pop up. Or we really are looking to form this partnership coalition and really work with you and how that can best happen.
And I just dropped a couple of people that I follow in the chat. So Todd, if you are saving the chat and sharing it with folks, these are some radical people I like to follow and base some of my work on.
Great. And Charles, if you could actually email it to me, just to be sure I get it, because I might lose it because I can't copy my chat. And that's
okay. I will. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great afternoon.
Thank you.
Thanks, folks.